Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at the shock doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
A pretty intense topic. You've probably heard of this book by Naomi Klein, 2007.
Right.
It came out. We're really going to go in depth on this one.
Yeah.
And we're going to be pulling from all sorts of sources. We've got historical analyses, excerpts from the book itself, even some dissenting opinions.
Sure.
So we can really dissect this theory and see how it plays out in the real world.
It's going to be fascinating, I think, to see how Klein connects all these seemingly random events.
Right.
You know, economic crashes,
Yeah.
natural disasters, even wars,
Yeah.
and sort of reveals this pattern of exploitation.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
The shock doctrine, Klein's argument, is that these shocks, these moments of intense upheaval, are used to push through radical economic policies that people would normally reject.
Right.
But in the chaos of the moment, they're more vulnerable.
Absolutely. Yeah, you talk about it. It's like this kind of economic blitzkrieg. Huh.
Where, people are disoriented.
Yeah.
They're desperate for solutions.
Right.
And so they're more likely to accept these really drastic changes that
Yeah.
they would never consider under normal circumstances.
So it's not just about things happening, it's about how those in power exploit those events to their advantage.
Yeah, exactly.
And to really see this in action, I think we have to go to a specific example.
Sure.
Let's start with Chile. In 1973, Pinochet's coup d'etat,
Right.
a brutal regime. And alongside the repression, we see a radical economic transformation spearheaded by the Chicago Boys.
Right, and these weren't just any economists, right? These were disciples of Milton Friedman,
Right.
trained at the University of Chicago with this very specific free market ideology, privatization, deregulation,
Right.
shrinking the role of government. It's all in their playbook.
So we have this incredibly volatile situation. The country is in shock, and these economists swoop in with their radical free market solutions. Was this just a coincidence, or is there something more calculated going on?
Well, Klein would say that's no coincidence at all.
Yeah.
The shock of the coup itself was this key ingredient in their success.
Right.
Hyperinflation was already ravaging the economy and creating this sense of desperation.
Yeah.
This yearning for any solution, no matter how radical.
It's almost like if someone is taking advantage of a house fire to convince the homeowner to do a complete remodel while they're, distracted.
Right.
But in this case, the fire was, in a sense, deliberately set.
Yeah, a stark analogy.
Yeah.
But I think it captures the essence of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And then the Chicago Boys, they come in and they implement these policies with lightning speed.
Right.
Tax cuts, free trade agreements, privatization of industries.
Yeah.
All rolled out with this speed and scope that was just overwhelming.
And we can't forget the backdrop of this economic shock therapy was brutal repression. Pinochet's regime was notorious for its human rights abuses, silencing anyone who dared to question this new economic order.
Yeah.
So do you think, is it possible that this level of violence wasn't just about eliminating dissent, but also about creating a climate of fear that made resistance to these radical policies almost impossible?
Yeah, that's the crucial question, right?
Yeah.
Is the violence simply about silencing dissent?
Yeah.
Or was it also a calculated tool to enforce compliance with the economic shock therapy?
Right.
Klein argues that it's both.
Yeah.
She calls it a deliberate strategy of shock and awe,
Yeah.
but applied not just militarily, but also to the economy.
And this brings us to, I think, a particularly chilling episode, the bombing of La Moneda,
Right.
the presidential palace where Allende and his supporters made their final stand.
Right.
It's a powerful symbol of democracy literally going up in flames.
And that's a critical insight, I think.
Yeah.
The symbolic power of these events.
Yeah.
It's not just about the policies themselves. It's about the message they send.
Yeah.
It's about breaking the spirit of resistance, demonstrating the overwhelming power of the new regime.
So we're starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
A deliberate strategy of using shock and violence to impose a radical economic agenda. And this pattern, tragically, wasn't limited to Chile.
Right.
Let's turn our attention to Argentina in the 1970s, another military junta this time, led by General Jorge Rafael Videla.
Right. Argentina, under Videla's rule, it became another grim chapter in this shock doctrine story.
Yeah.
And this time, The weapon of choice was this particularly insidious form of terror,
Mm-hmm.
disappearances.
Tens of thousands vanished, their families left in this perpetual state of anguish,
Right.
not knowing the fate of their loved ones.
Yeah.
The psychological impact of this type of terror is almost unimaginable.
It was a deliberate strategy of creating this pervasive climate of fear.
Right?
People were too terrified to speak out, too afraid to even ask questions.
Yeah.
It's about atomizing society, making any kind of collective resistance impossible.
And against this backdrop of terror, the junta was busy implementing, you guessed it, Chicago school economic policies.
Exactly the same script, different actors.
Privatization, deregulation, cuts to social spending.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
The shock doctrine isn't tied to any specific regime or ideology.
Right.
It's a tactic that can be used by anyone seeking to impose radical change regardless of their political leanings.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
But it helps to explain the widespread appeal of this strategy.
Sure.
But let's delve a little bit deeper into the specifics of the Argentine case.
Okay.
One detail that really stuck with me was the junta's practice of dropping victims from airplanes into the Rio de la Plata.
Right.
A chilling echo of similar atrocities committed in other countries.
This wasn't just brutality for its own sake, right?
Right.
This was about sending a message.
Yeah.
A message of absolute power and ruthlessness.
Right.
It was about breaking the will of the people, leaving them too traumatized to resist the economic shock therapy being imposed.
So we see this pattern repeating itself, a major shock, followed by the implementation of radical economic policies, often with the backing of international institutions like the IMF.
Right.
But Klein argues that this pattern isn't limited to dictatorships.
Yeah.
She points to Margaret Thatcher's reign in the UK as a prime example of the shock doctrine being applied in a democratic context.
Yeah, Thatcher's case is interesting because it challenges this assumption that the shock doctrine can only thrive in these authoritarian regimes.
Right.
Right. She came to power in 1979, inheriting an economy in turmoil, widespread labor strikes,
Right.
the sense of national malaise.
Yeah.
And then comes the Falklands War in 1982.
It seems like kind of a peripheral conflict. Thatcher masterfully uses this wave of patriotism and national unity generated by the war to push through her radical free market agenda.
Exactly.
Privatization, deregulation, crushing the unions, it all happened under this banner of national unity.
And that speaks to the adaptability of the shock doctrine.
Right.
Right. It's this chameleon-like tactic capable of morphing to fit different political landscapes.
Yeah.
In Thatcher's case, it was about using this moment of national crisis to achieve a predetermined economic objective.
Right.
And it worked.
Yeah, this brings us to, I think, a critical point. The shock doctrine goes global.
Yeah.
Klein traces its influence from the debt crises in Latin America and Africa in the 1980s to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And the subsequent shock therapy implemented in Russia under Boris Yeltsin.
And what's striking, I think, is the consistency of the playbook.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
A major shock, whether economic, political, or social,
Right.
creates this window of opportunity. And in that window, powerful actors, often with the backing of these international institutions like the IMF,
Yeah.
they swoop in to impose their agenda,
Right.
knowing full well that under normal circumstances, these policies would face fierce resistance.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And create or exploit the crisis, then offer the solution you wanted all along, knowing that people are more likely to accept these drastic measures when they're in a state of panic.
It's a cynical strategy,
Yeah.
but as we've seen, incredibly effective.
Yeah, and perhaps the most jarring example of this in the 21st century is the invasion and occupation of Iraq.
Right.
Now, Iraq is a complex situation, to say the least.
Sure.
But Klein argues that the shock and awe military strategy employed in the invasion was designed not just to overwhelm the Iraqi military,
Right.
but also to shock the entire population into a state of submission.
And remember, this was a population already reeling from years of sanctions and a previous war.
Right.
The invasion itself was the ultimate shock.
Yeah.
And in its wake, Paul Bremer, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority,
Right.
unleashes this wave of radical economic reforms
Right.
that were essentially ripped from the Chicago Boys playbook.
Mass privatization, deregulation, opening up Iraq's economy to foreign corporations. It was a fire sale of a nation's assets, all while bombs are still falling.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, one particularly damaging policy was the de-Ba'athification program.
Right.
This resulted in the dismissal of hundreds of thousands of skilled Iraqi workers,
Yeah.
many of whom had nothing to do with the Ba'ath Party,
Right.
creating this chaos and instability that further weakened the country.
It's a classic example of ideological blindness leading to disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
The Bush administration was so fixated on implementing this free market fundamentalism
Right.
that they failed to grasp the complexities of Iraqi society and the need for a more nuanced approach to reconstruction.
It almost feels like a case study in how not to rebuild a nation.
Yeah.
But Klein doesn't stop there. She also examines how natural disasters have been exploited to advance the shock doctrine agenda.
Right.
For example, the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka.
While people are still burying their dead and trying to rebuild their lives, the Sri Lankan government, with the backing of these international institutions, began pushing for privatization of land and the development of luxury tourism, often displacing local communities who had already lost everything.
It's hard to fathom that level of disconnect, that lack of empathy. It's like saying, hey, a tsunami just wiped out your entire village.
Right.
But don't worry, we're going to build a 5-star resort right here on top of the rubble.
And tragically, this pattern isn't unique to Sri Lanka.
Right.
Klein draws these parallels to the reconstruction efforts after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans,
Yeah.
where similar policies were implemented, leading to privatization of schools,
Right.
loss of public sector jobs, and the displacement of entire communities.
Right. So essentially, these natural disasters become opportunities to further entrench inequality.
Exactly.
To push vulnerable communities off their land.
Yeah.
And to replace public services with private, for-profit alternatives.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the people who suffer most are often those who were already the most vulnerable. The poor.
Yeah.
The marginalized, those who lack the resources to resist or rebuild.
But even in the face of this bleak reality, there are glimmers of hope.
There are.
Because throughout history, people have found ways to resist the shock doctrine, to challenge its logic, and to create alternatives.
That's right.
So we're seeing these, devastating consequences of the shock doctrine.
Right.
But where did these ideas even come from?
Right.
Like, to really understand that, I think we need to go back to the source, the Chicago School of Economics.
Yeah, the Chicago School, it wasn't just an academic institution.
Right.
It was a breeding ground for this very specific ideology, free market fundamentalism. And the high priest of this ideology was Milton Friedman, this brilliant but controversial economist.
Okay, so break it down for me. What was at the core of Friedman's thinking?
Well, Friedman believed that free markets with minimal government intervention were the key to prosperity.
Right?
And even freedom.
Okay.
He saw government as inherently inefficient, a hindrance to economic growth,
Right.
and ultimately a threat to individual liberty.
But don't we need some level of regulation to prevent monopolies?
Right.
To protect consumers?
Sure.
To ensure, like, a level playing field?
Yeah.
Otherwise, wouldn't the strong just crush the weak?
That's where the debate gets interesting.
Yeah.
Friedman argued that these issues could be addressed through market mechanisms without the need for heavy-handed government regulation.
Okay.
He had this almost unshakable faith in the self-regulating nature of markets.
But what about situations where the market fails to self-regulate?
Sure.
Like where powerful actors exploit loopholes or engage in predatory practices?
Right.
Like, history is full of examples of that.
Well, Friedman's followers would argue that those failures are often the result of existing government intervention.
Okay.
They would say that the market is actually being prevented from correcting itself.
Right.
So their solution is dismantle regulations, privatize industries, and let the invisible hand work its magic.
But critics argue that this magic often leads to increased inequality.
Sure.
A concentration of wealth in the hands of a few.
Right.
And a shrinking middle class.
Right.
I mean, these are trends we've seen in many countries that have embraced these policies.
That's a key critique of the Chicago School, that its blind faith in markets ignores the realities of power,
Yeah.
the potential for exploitation, and the need for social safety nets.
So essentially, it's like a clash of worldviews.
Yeah.
One side sees government as the problem. The other sees it as part of the solution.
Right.
And this battle of ideas has had very real consequences for people around the world.
Absolutely. And the shock doctrine, as Klein describes it, is essentially the weaponization of this ideology. It's about using moments of crisis to ram through these policies that would be fiercely resisted under normal circumstances.
It's like taking advantage of someone's vulnerability
Yeah.
to force them into a deal they'd never agree to if they were thinking clearly.
Now, to be fair, the Chicago School's influence isn't monolithic.
Right.
Right. There are different interpretations of Friedman's ideas,
Sure.
and not all of his followers endorse these more extreme applications of the shock doctrine.
Right. But it's undeniable that his ideas,
Yeah.
especially the emphasis on free markets and minimal government, have had this profound impact on global economic policy, especially since the 1980s.
Right.
Think about the rise of neoliberalism, with its focus on privatization, deregulation, and free trade. Can be traced directly back to the Chicago School's influence.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to Chile,
Right.
which became this first real-world laboratory for these ideas. But I think it's crucial to understand the context,
Yeah.
the forces that were already at play in Latin America to see how this experiment unfolded.
So it's like setting the stage for this dramatic play.
Exactly.
You know, we need to understand the backdrop, the motivations, the tensions to really grasp what happened.
Right. And the backdrop for the Chilean experiment was the Cold War.
Yeah.
This global struggle between two opposing ideologies, communism, capitalism.
Right.
Latin America, with its history of colonialism, inequality, and social unrest, became this key battleground in this ideological conflict.
So it's like this perfect storm brewing.
Yeah.
You've got the U.S. fiercely anti-communist trying to exert its influence in the region.
Right.
You've got the Soviet Union supporting left-wing movements. And in the middle, you have Latin American countries trying to find their own path.
Yeah.
Often struggling with poverty, inequality, and political instability.
Right. It's a volatile mix.
Yeah, it is.
And into this mix, you introduce Milton Friedman and the Chicago School,
Right.
offering what seemed like a simple solution, free markets as the path to prosperity and freedom. But their experiment in Chile would have far-reaching and devastating consequences.
So how did Friedman's ideas actually get implemented in Chile?
Okay.
Like, was there a deliberate plan to make this happen?
There was indeed.
Yeah.
It all started with a program called the Chile Project back in the 1950s.
Okay.
The U.S. government, through the Ford Foundation, began funding a program to send Chilean students to study economics at the University of Chicago.
It sounds almost like a scholarship program.
Right.
But with a very specific agenda in mind?
Precisely the goal was to train a new generation of Chilean economists in the free market ideology of the Chicago School,
Right.
hoping they would return to Chile and implement those ideas. And these students, who became known as the Chicago Boys,
Right.
they embraced Friedman's theories wholeheartedly.
But was Chile really ready for such a radical transformation?
Right.
What were the conditions like in the country at the time?
Chile in the 1950s and 60s, it was a democracy,
Okay.
but facing serious challenges.
Okay.
There was poverty, inequality, and growing frustration with the pace of economic progress.
Right.
Many Chileans felt like the existing economic model just wasn't working.
So there's this sense of discontent,
Yeah.
this yearning for change. And the Chicago Boys arrive,
Right.
armed with their free market solutions, promising this new path to prosperity.
And then comes the pivotal moment.
Yeah.
General Augusto Pinochet seizes power in this violent coup in 1973,
Right.
overthrowing the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende.
That coup was such a turning point in Chilean history.
Oh, was.
It ushered in this era of brutal repression, human rights abuses, and this radical economic transformation.
Right.
How did the Chicago Boys capitalize on this upheaval?
Well, the coup itself was a shock,
Yeah.
a trauma that created this climate of fear and disorientation.
Right.
And the Chicago Boys, they were ready.
Huh.
They swooped in with their radical free market agenda,
Right.
implementing a series of sweeping reforms that became known as shock therapy.
Shock therapy, it's a very evocative term.
It is.
What exactly did those reforms entail?
They included tax cuts, privatization of state-owned industries,
Right.
deregulation of the financial sector,
Okay.
and cuts to social programs.
Yeah. So a complete overhaul of the Chilean economy,
It was a complete overhaul.
designed to shrink the role of the state and unleash the power of the market.
Exactly.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially in a country already reeling from a coup and widespread violence.
And for many Chileans, it was.
Yeah.
While some argue that these reforms eventually led to economic growth, the immediate impact was devastating.
Right.
Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty increased, and inequality widened dramatically.
But wouldn't the Chicago Boys and their supporters argue that this pain was a necessary side effect of a long-term solution?
Yeah.
This kind of short-term sacrifice for future prosperity?
That was their argument, short-term pain for long-term gain.
Right.
But critics point out that this pain was disproportionately borne by the poorest and most vulnerable segments of Chilean society.
It's like saying we need to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Right.
But those eggs are people's lives.
Exactly.
Their livelihoods, their ability to feed their families.
And it's crucial to remember that these economic reforms were implemented under this brutal dictatorship.
Right.
Pinochet's regime systematically silenced dissent, using torture, disappearances, and exile to crush any opposition.
So it's not just about economics, it's about power control.
Right.
Imposing an ideology through force.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Chicago Boys and their free market experiment in Chile could not have succeeded without the repression and violence of the Pinochet regime.
Yeah.
It's this chilling reminder that economic policies always have a human cost.
Right.
And those costs can be magnified by the political context in which they're implemented.
So Chile became this testing ground for the shock doctrine.
It did.
A model for how these ideas could be applied in other countries.
Right.
So where did this experiment in economic shock therapy go next?
From Chile, the shock doctrine spread throughout Latin America, often with the backing of the U.S. government and international institutions like the IMF.
Right.
Argentina, under its own military junta, became another laboratory for these ideas with equally devastating consequences.
Yeah.
It's almost like a virus spreading, exploiting vulnerabilities, leaving this trail of economic and social devastation in its wake.
A potent analogy in just like a virus.
Yeah.
The shock doctrine adapted to fit different contexts.
Yeah.
In Argentina, as in Chile, it was implemented through this combination of state-sponsored terror and radical economic reforms.
But Argentina's brand of state terror was particularly chilling.
It was.
The disappearances,
Yeah.
the secret prisons,
Right.
the systematic use of torture.
It was a period of unimaginable cruelty.
It was.
It was this reign of terror meticulously designed to silence any opposition.
Right.
People were too terrified to speak out, too afraid to even ask questions.
Yeah.
It was about atomizing society, making any kind of collective resistance impossible.
And while this terror was unfolding, the junta, heavily influenced by the Chicago Boys, was busy dismantling Argentina's economy.
Right.
It's hard to imagine the level of trauma and disorientation people must have experienced during that time. It's like having the rug pulled out from under you while someone's holding a gun to your head.
That's a powerful image.
Okay.
And it captures the essence of the shock doctrine.
Yeah.
This trauma, this shock. It was essential to the success of the shock therapy.
Right.
People were too terrified to resist, too focused on survival to challenge the economic agenda being imposed on them.
And wasn't there also a deliberate strategy of targeting intellectuals?
There was?
Activists, or anyone who might pose a threat to the regime's power.
Absolutely. Universities were purged, journalists were silenced, and trade unionists were arrested, tortured, and often disappeared.
Wow.
It was a systematic campaign to eradicate any potential source of opposition,
Right.
to create a society where dissent was unthinkable.
So it wasn't just about economics, it was about thought control.
It was
about
yes.
creating this climate of fear that permeated every aspect of society.
Precisely. And the Argentine junta, like Pinochet's regime in Chile, was incredibly effective at this.
Yeah.
They created this climate of fear so pervasive that it lingered long after the dictatorship ended.
It's a chilling reminder that the wounds of trauma and repression can run deep, shaping a society for generations.
Yeah. And the economic scars can be equally enduring.
Right.
In Argentina, the shock therapy led to massive unemployment, hyperinflation, and this sharp increase in poverty.
Right.
It took decades for the country to recover.
It's a sobering thought. The shock doctrine might promise these quick fixes and rapid growth.
Right.
But the reality is often far more complex and painful.
It is.
And the damage it inflicts can take years, even decades, to repair.
It's a cautionary tale, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that the story doesn't end there.
Right.
Because wherever the shock doctrine has been applied, people have found ways to resist,
Yeah.
to challenge its logic,
Right.
and to create alternatives.
Okay, so let's talk about resistance.
Okay.
Where do we see the first cracks in the shock doctrine armor? Where do people start to push back against this seemingly unstoppable force?
One of the earliest and most inspiring examples comes from Poland in the 1980s. Remember, this was a country that had been under communist rule for decades,
Right.
with a centrally planned economy and limited individual freedoms. And it was also a country where the shock doctrine was eventually applied
Right.
after the fall of communism.
Right.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
Tell me about the first stirrings of resistance.
So in the early 1980s, a trade union movement called Solidarity emerged in Poland,
It did.
led by an electrician named Lech Walesa.
Right.
Solidarity was unique because it wasn't just about workers' rights.
Right.
It was this broader movement for social and political change, challenging the very foundations of the communist system.
Yeah. Solidarity captured the imagination of the world.
It did.
It was this classic David versus Goliath story
Right.
with ordinary workers standing up to this powerful and oppressive regime.
Yeah, and they were incredibly successful, at least for a while.
They were through a combination of strikes, protests, and negotiations.
Right.
Solidarity forced the Polish government to make significant concessions,
Yeah,
including recognizing the right to form independent trade unions
Wow.
and holding free elections.
It was a stunning victory for this grassroots movement.
It was.
It showed that even in this seemingly tightly controlled communist state,
Right.
people could find ways to resist, to organize, and to demand change.
Absolutely. But their resistance wasn't just about rejecting communism.
It wasn't.
It's important to note that Solidarity's resistance was also about rejecting the kind of unbridled capitalism
Right.
that was being promoted by the Chicago School.
Uh-huh.
They had seen the effects of these policies in other countries,
Right.
and they wanted something different for Poland.
So they were fighting for this different vision of the future,
They were.
one that combined economic justice with social solidarity.
Exactly. And that vision resonated with millions of Poles who had experienced both the hardships of communism and the allure of Western consumerism. They wanted a system that worked for everyone, not just for the wealthy elite.
It's a reminder that resistance isn't just about saying no.
Right.
It's also about offering a positive alternative.
Yeah.
This vision of a different world.
And that's what makes Solidarity so inspiring.
Yeah.
They showed that it was possible to challenge these dominant ideologies of the time,
Right.
both communism and unbridled capitalism,
Right.
and to offer this different path.
Mm-hmm.
They offered a vision of a society based on democratic values, social solidarity, and economic justice.
It's a vision that resonates even today,
It does.
especially in a world where inequality is growing and faith in traditional institutions is declining.
Absolutely.
But was Solidarity's success just a fleeting moment, or did it have this lasting impact?
Right.
Did their vision for a different kind of society actually come to fruition?
That's a complicated question.
Yeah.
While Solidarity's initial victories were remarkable,
Mm-hmm.
the movement faced significant challenges in the years that followed. Internal divisions, external pressures, and the complexities of transitioning from a communist system to this market-based economy
Yeah.
all took their toll.
It's often said that revolutions devour their own children.
Yeah.
The ideals that ignite a movement can be difficult to sustain
Right.
when faced with the messy realities of governing.
And in Poland's case, the transition to a market economy was particularly challenging.
Yeah.
The shock therapy prescribed by Jeffrey Sachs and other Western economists led to significant economic hardship for many Poles, fueling resentment and disillusionment.
So it's like the cure being worse than the disease. The
Right.
very ideology that Solidarity had resisted unbridled capitalism was now being implemented in the name of reform.
And for many Poles, it felt like a betrayal.
Right.
Their hopes for this more just and equitable society seemed to be slipping away.
Yeah.
The shock therapy created winners and losers,
Mm-hmm.
and those who lost out often felt like they'd been sacrificed on the altar of the free market.
It's a tragic irony. And it highlights the challenges of resisting the shock doctrine in a world where its proponents wield so much economic and political power.
Right.
But despite the setbacks, Solidarity's legacy endures.
It does, absolutely.
Their struggle inspired similar movements around the world, and their vision for this more just and democratic society continues to inform social and political activism today.
It's a reminder that resistance is a process, not an event.
Yeah.
There will be victories and setbacks, moments of hope and periods of despair,
Right.
but the fight for a better world never really ends.
And as we've seen, resistance can take many forms,
It can.
from strikes and protests
Right.
to grassroots organizing and political activism.
Oh.
It can happen anywhere, from the streets of Buenos Aires
Yeah.
to the shipyards of Gdansk to the flooded neighborhoods of New Orleans.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about grand gestures or revolutionary movements. It's also about these everyday acts of courage, about people standing up for their rights, about communities coming together to support each other in times of crisis.
And those everyday acts of resistance multiplied across communities and countries can have this profound impact.
Yeah.
They can challenge the logic of the shock doctrine,
Right.
expose its flaws,
Uh-huh.
and offer a glimpse of this different kind of future.
So let's shift our focus to some of those everyday acts of resistance, to the people and communities who are finding ways to fight back against the shock doctrine and create alternatives to its destructive logic.
One place to look is Latin America.
Okay.
The very region that was first subjected to the shock doctrine experiment.
Right.
In recent decades, there's been this resurgence of resistance to neoliberalism with new social movements emerging and left-leaning governments coming to power that are challenging the Washington consensus.
So it's like this boomerang effect.
Yeah.
The region that was first hit by the shock doctrine is now leading the charge against it.
Right.
It's a story of remarkable resilience.
It is, and it's fueled by this deep understanding of the costs of neoliberalism, of the social and economic devastation that's left behind. People in Latin America have lived through this experiment, seen its failures, and they're demanding something different.
So let's get specific.
Good.
What are some examples of this resistance in action?
All right.
What are people doing to fight back?
One example is the rise of these grassroots movements challenging privatization and corporate power.
Okay.
Across Latin America, we see communities organizing to protect their land, their water, and their public services from being sold off to multinational corporations.
So it's like this reclaiming of the commons, a pushback against the enclosure of public goods for private profit. They're saying enough is enough.
These movements are drawing a line in the sand, declaring our water is not for sale, our education is not for profit, our healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
It's a powerful message, and it's resonating across the region.
It is.
And isn't there also this growing movement for worker-owned cooperatives?
There is.
As an alternative to these traditional capitalist models.
We're seeing this resurgence of interest in cooperatives.
Yeah.
In worker-owned and community-controlled enterprises.
Okay.
These models offer a different way of organizing production. One that prioritizes democratic decision-making, social responsibility, and this more equitable distribution of wealth.
So it's like saying, if capitalism isn't working for us, let's create something different.
Yeah.
Something that puts people and the planet before profit.
Exactly.
It's about taking back control.
It is, and these cooperative models are proving to be remarkably successful.
Yeah.
Not just in Latin America, but in other parts of the world as well. Yeah. They offer this viable alternative to the shock doctrine logic of privatization and deregulation.
It's inspiring to see these alternative models emerging.
Yeah.
But aren't they still facing this uphill battle against the dominant forces of global capitalism?
They are, but I think the momentum is shifting.
Yeah.
People are waking up to the fact that there are other ways of organizing society, of producing goods and services, of creating wealth and prosperity.
And this shift in thinking is also reflected in the political landscape, isn't it?
It is.
We've seen this wave of left-leaning governments coming to power in Latin America, challenging the Washington consensus and the shock doctrine agenda.
That's right. Leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador have all implemented policies that challenge the neoliberal orthodoxy.
Okay.
They've nationalized industries, increased social spending, and worked to reduce inequality.
But these leaders have also faced intense criticism.
They have.
Accusations of authoritarianism and mismanagement of their economies are common.
Right.
How do we reconcile those critiques with the positive changes they've made?
It's important to acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns about the way some of these governments have exercised power, but it's also essential to understand the context.
Right.
The historical legacy of colonialism and U.S. intervention.
Yeah.
And the deep inequalities these leaders are trying to address.
So it's this complex picture.
It is.
It's not about idealizing these leaders or their policies, but recognizing that they represent this broader movement for change, a pushback against the shock doctrine and its devastating consequences.
Exactly. And these governments, despite their flaws, have given voice to the millions of Latin Americans who have been marginalized and impoverished by neoliberalism.
Right.
They offer this sense of hope that a different future is possible.
So it's not just about specific economic policy, but about a shift in consciousness, a reclaiming of agency, a belief that people can shape their own destiny.
And that shift in consciousness is perhaps the most significant threat to the shock doctrine, as people become aware of the tactics being used against them, as they understand the logic of disaster capitalism, they become less vulnerable to manipulation.
So knowledge is power.
It is.
Understanding how the shock doctrine operates is the first step toward resisting its influence.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the more people understand these tactics, the more they connect the dots between these seemingly disparate events, the stronger the resistance will become.
Okay. We've explored the dark underbelly of the shock doctrine.
We have.
Its origins, its implementation, its devastating consequences.
Right.
But we've also seen those inspiring flickers of hope.
Yeah.
Examples of resistance and the emergence of alternatives. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the most pressing challenges and opportunities for those seeking to resist the shock doctrine and build this more just and equitable world.
Okay, so we've really gone deep, haven't we, on this whole shock doctrine thing?
We have.
Uncovering its origins, its tactics, its devastating consequences.
Yeah.
But, like, we've also seen there are these glimmers of hope, right? People are resisting.
Absolutely.
We're building alternatives, and that gives me some sense of hope.
Hope is essential.
Yeah.
Especially when dealing with such a heavy topic.
Right.
But hope without action is insufficient.
Right.
We need to translate that hope into concrete strategies for change.
So let's talk solutions.
Okay.
If the shock doctrine thrives on crisis and disorientation, how can we as individuals and as a collective counter that?
Right.
What can we do to build resilience and protect ourselves from these tactics?
I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
The more people understand the shock doctrine, the less effective it becomes. It's like a magician's trick.
Right.
Once you know how it's done, it loses its power.
So it's about education.
Yeah.
Spreading the word, helping people connect the dots between these seemingly disparate events.
Absolutely.
But knowledge alone isn't enough.
No, it's not. We need to move beyond analysis and into action. And one of the most effective ways to counter the shock doctrine is to build these strong social movements.
Okay.
That demand economic justice and democratic control over our economies.
So supporting organizations that fight for workers' rights, for environmental protection, for fair trade, for a more equitable distribution of wealth.
That's about putting our energy and resources where our values are.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's about getting involved in our communities, supporting those who are on the front lines, fighting for this more just and sustainable world.
Yeah.
It's about making our voices heard. Through voting, through activism, through holding our elected officials accountable.
It's about recognizing that we're not powerless.
Exactly.
That we have agency.
Right.
And that our collective actions can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But let's face it.
Yeah.
The forces promoting the shock doctrine, they're powerful.
Right.
They have vast resources. They influence media narratives.
Yeah.
And they often operate in the shadows.
How do we counter that?
One way is to build resilience at the local level.
Okay.
Strong communities with robust social safety nets and this deep sense of solidarity are less vulnerable to the shock doctrine's tactics.
Right.
When people trust each other and have each other's backs, they're less likely to panic and accept these drastic measures in times of crisis.
So it's about building those networks of support?
It is.
Those bonds of community.
Yeah.
Those spaces where people feel seen, heard, and valued.
Absolutely.
It's about creating a world where we're not just individuals competing against each other, but a collective working together for the common good.
And it's about being proactive.
Okay.
The shock doctrine often thrives on exploiting these pre-existing vulnerabilities.
Right.
So addressing issues like poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation before they reach these crisis levels can make us less susceptible to these tactics.
It's about thinking long term.
What is?
About building this more just and sustainable world that's less prone to shocks in the first place.
Right.
But let's be realistic.
Okay.
There will always be crises.
There will.
There will always be those who seek to exploit those crises for their own gain.
Right.
So what can we do to prepare ourselves for those inevitable shocks?
One crucial step is to be aware of the potential shocks on the horizon.
Okay.
What are the crises, the disruptions, the events that could be exploited to advance this shock doctrine agenda?
So let's play a little what-if game.
Sure.
What are some of the potential shocks we need to be paying attention to right now? What are the things that keep you up at night?
Climate change is the big one.
Yeah.
As the impacts of climate change intensify,
right.
We're going to see more extreme weather events, more displacement, more resource scarcity, and more conflict.
Right.
And these crises could easily be exploited by those seeking to profit from chaos and instability.
It's that never let a good crisis go to waste mentality.
Exactly.
But on a global scale,
Right, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
no, they couldn't.
We need to ensure that responses to climate change are guided by these principles of justice, equity, and sustainability,
Right.
not by the logic of disaster capitalism.
So it's about demanding a just transition to a clean energy economy.
Right.
Making sure that those most impacted by climate change have a voice in shaping solutions
Yeah.
and preventing corporations from profiting from this crisis.
Absolutely.
It's a tall order, but it's essential.
It is, and it's about remembering that climate change isn't just an environmental issue,
Right.
right? It's a social and economic issue as well.
Uh-huh.
It's about power inequality and who gets to control the resources we need to adapt to this changing world.
So climate change is a big one, no doubt.
It is.
What other potential shocks are looming on the horizon?
The rise of artificial intelligence and automation is another big concern.
Okay.
As these technologies advance,
Uh-huh.
we're likely to see significant job displacement,
Right.
increased inequality, and potentially social unrest. These disruptions could be exploited to further erode workers' rights and concentrate wealth in the hands of this technological elite.
It's a frightening prospect, this future, where robots are doing all the work
Right.
and a handful of tech billionaires control everything.
It highlights the need to be proactive in shaping these technological changes.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that they benefit all of humanity,
Right.
not just a select few.
Right.
This means demanding policies that promote job creation, retraining programs, and this more equitable distribution of the benefits of technological progress.
So it's about demanding a future of shared prosperity.
It is.
It's not one where the gains of automation are hoarded by this tiny elite.
Right.
It's about making sure that everyone benefits from these advances, not just those who already have the most.
And it's about recognizing that technology is not neutral.
Right.
It's shaped by the values and interests of those who create and control it.
Uh-huh.
We need to be active participants in shaping the future of technology.
Yeah. No.
Not passive consumers.
Okay, so we've got climate change.
Mhm.
We've got automation.
Yeah,
Those are some pretty big shocks to be aware of.
they are.
Any others we should have on our radar?
Well, there's always the potential for another global financial crisis.
Right.
The 2008 crisis showed us how quickly markets can collapse
Yeah.
and how those collapses can be exploited to bail out the wealthy while leaving ordinary people to bear the costs.
It's that classic privatize the profits, socialize the losses scenario.
Exactly. We need to be vigilant in demanding stronger financial regulations,
Right.
greater transparency and accountability from those who control our financial system.
Uh-huh.
And we need to be wary of calls for austerity and cuts to social programs in the wake of a financial crisis.
It's about remembering that there are alternatives to the shock doctrine playbook.
There are.
That there are ways to respond to crises that prioritize people and the planet over profit and greed.
Yeah.
It's about choosing a different path.
And it's about recognizing that the shock doctrine isn't just this set of economic policies. It's a mindset, a way of seeing the world.
Uh-huh.
It's a belief that crises are opportunities,
Right.
that the strong should exploit the weak,
Yeah.
and that the market should dictate everything.
So it's ultimately a battle of ideas.
It is.
A clash of worldviews.
Right. And the outcome of this battle will determine what kind of future we create.
We need to offer this different vision, a vision of a world based on cooperation, solidarity, and this deep respect for the interconnectedness of all life.
Yes. A world where we respond to crises with compassion and creativity,
Right.
not with exploitation and greed.
It's a challenging task,
It is.
but it's also deeply inspiring
It is.
because ultimately the future's not predetermined.
It's not.
We create it through our choices, our actions, and our unwavering belief in a better world.
Well said. And on that note,
Yeah.
I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
It's been a heavy but essential conversation.
It has been. Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
The shock doctrine might be this powerful force, but it's not invincible.
Right.
The human spirit is even stronger.
Yeah.
As long as we keep resisting, keep organizing, and keep fighting for a better world, there's always hope.
Hope is what keeps us going.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a journey,
It has.
but hopefully a thought-provoking and empowering one.
I hope so.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, take care.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged,
Stay safe.
and most importantly, stay hopeful.